Well, for more analysis on the situation in Colombia, now let's go live to Cynthia J. Arnson, Director of the Latin American Program at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's start with this strike that's planned for today. How big could this be?
Well, it could be very big. There have been demonstrations for many days now throughout the country, and the National Strike Committee is one of the main forces that has called these demonstrations. So I suspect that there will be a lot of demonstrations throughout the country, and one hopes not the kind of violence that we've seen up until now. Violence by the police against protesters, and also terrible acts of vandalism and destruction of property by some groups. It's not clear who they are. The government says that they are illegal armed groups, including the guerrillas that are still active, that are provoking these acts of violence. And the destruction has been of infrastructure, of transportation, has been quite just severe.
There are so many issues at stake here that I was mentioning before. What would you say are people most angry about?
Well, I think it's just a combination of issues. The obvious motive behind the demonstrations initially was a tax reform that was aimed actually at protecting poor households, but also raised taxes on the middle class, on the lower middle class, on basic goods like milk and coffee. And that, I think, was, as they say in Spanish, the drop that made the cup overflow, or in English, the straw that broke the camel's back. And so, Colombia has been under a very severe lockdown, under waves of lockdowns. The pandemic is not under control. Unemployment has risen. Poverty has risen about 10 points after making a great deal of progress in recent years. It's a very unequal country in the region that is the most unequal in the world. Colombia is at the top or number 2, depending on the figures that you use. And I think it was just this explosion of discontent in urban areas. There have been protests about the violence in rural areas against social leaders, people claiming their land titles, people defending human rights, and that has been a significant issue, behind protests about the failure to fully implement the peace agreement. But this is really different. This is urban Colombia, which is about 80% of the country, coming out and showing its grievance. And what really, I think, quite literally threw gasoline on the fire was the kind of police response that came out initially, with excessive use of force against demonstrators, at times firing with live ammunition. And there have been any number of human rights organizations, the United Nations, the European Union, that have condemned the behavior of troops. At the same time, some of the demonstrators have been violent, not all, but some have been. And the government has basically used that to justify the harsh response.
Just a very quick word on the violence. As you were saying, these are the bloodiest demonstrations since the peace agreement with the FARC in 2016. Many groups are accusing the president, Ivan Duque, and his government of being complacent in the use of public force. Are they right?
Well, there has to be, I think it goes to a much bigger structural issue. In Colombia, the police is still part of the Ministry of Defense. There have been long-standing calls for a civilian demilitarized police force. The police historically in Colombia has had one of the major responsibilities for drug eradication. It's trained in civilian policing, but it also has a lot of these sort of quasi-military functions. And it has responded with a great deal of brutality in certain instances, and the behavior, I think, needs to be brought under control. At the same time, the president's own party is calling for a stronger, more rapid and ferocious response to the demonstrators, to just basically stop them and bring the country back under control.
Cynthia, thank you for that. Cynthia Arnson there speaking to us from Washington. Now, with Islamist extremism beginning to